In a mansion built on silence and distance, a billionaire keeps his blind father hidden from the world, and his pet pig Harry is just another eccentric detail in a life of isolation. But one ordinary day, something extraordinary begins. The pig and the old man start to move together, as if sharing a language no one else can understand. And when the new maid steps into that moment, she does something no one expects, and it changes everything. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this story from. We love knowing how far our tales travel. This is another beautiful story from Mr. Edward's Tales, where you truly feel the emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. William Carter was a man who had mastered the art of emotional isolation. Since the death of his wife, the mansion where he lived had become a silent tomb of old routines and untouched memories. Within this enormous house resided his aging father, Arthur, an autistic man whose past traumas had carved deep grooves into his identity. He was also blind, a condition that arrived later in life, but felt like the final act of a long, cruel play. William didn't know how to reach him, and maybe he no longer wanted to. Arthur remained in near-complete silence, sitting every day in the same faded armchair, his white cane resting across his knees, sunglasses obscuring the depth of his sightless eyes. No one in the house dared disturb him. Meals were left untouched, questions went unanswered, and even eye contact, if it could be made, was impossible. Arthur had become more a statue than a man, and to William that made it easier to ignore the guilt of emotional distance. Conversations between them had long since ceased, replaced by nods, brief grunts, or total absence. William justified it with excuses. His father was difficult, damaged, unreachable. But deep down, he knew the silence was a symptom of surrender. The only creature in the mansion that seemed to orbit Arthur with any consistency was a pig, an actual, oversized, pampered pig named Harry. Years ago, William had gifted the animal to his wife, half as a joke, half as a gesture of eccentric love. She had adored the pig, treated him like royalty, and even trained him to follow her around like a loyal dog. But after her death, Harry had been left to drift through the mansion like a strange ghost of the woman who once brought life into its rooms. He had a velvet mat to sleep on, a silver bowl for gourmet food, and more freedom than most of the staff, but he was alone. Despite his luxuries, Harry seemed to sense that something fundamental was missing, and somehow, in his own way, he began gravitating toward Arthur. Day after day, he would nudge open the door to the sitting room, sniff at Arthur's feet, and linger there, as if waiting for something to happen. Arthur never responded outright, but neither did he flinch or recoil. His hand might brush Harry's back now and then, fingers barely making contact. That brief touch was the most contact either of them had with another living being. It was not affection exactly, but it wasn't rejection either. William, for his part, remained oblivious. He was the kind of man who saw problems as checklists to delegate. His father's care was a box he had already ticked: food, shelter, medical attention, silence. Done. The pig, too, was just another quirk of the house, a harmless remnant of a woman he preferred not to remember too deeply. His days were dominated by meetings, reports, and transactions, not emotions. He told himself that keeping the house running was a kind of devotion, that avoiding emotional entanglements was a sign of strength. But the truth was simpler and sadder. He didn't know how to process grief, neither his own nor his father's, and so he let silence fill the void. Still, even he occasionally noticed odd moments, his father's face subtly tilted in Harry's direction, or the pig resting more comfortably near Arthur's legs than anywhere else in the house. These details struck him like brief drafts of wind in a sealed room, curious but never worth opening a window to investigate. He missed entirely the delicate tension building between two forgotten souls at the heart of his home. He saw no significance in the pig's loyalty, nor in the old man's stillness shifting ever so slightly. Everything began to shift with the arrival of a new maid. Her name was Aliyah, and she wasn't like the others who had come and gone without leaving a trace. She was a black woman in her 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of practical strength that comes from a life spent caring for people no one else knew how to handle. William hired her with minimal attention, another task checked off. But Aliyah didn't just clean and cook. She watched. From the first day, she noticed Arthur's subtle reactions, how he turned his head toward certain voices, how his fingers twitched slightly when Harry approached, how the silence around him felt less like peace and more like a cage. She didn't push. She didn't force smiles or small talk. Instead, she let herself become a consistent rhythm in the background, folding herself into the fabric of the house in a way that felt intentional. She spoke while she worked, not to Arthur, but near him, narrating her actions casually so he would know someone was present. She began placing Harry's bedding nearer to Arthur's chair, small changes, thoughtful ones, and while Arthur didn't say a word, his posture began to shift almost imperceptibly. The house had adjusted to accommodate Aliyah's presence, and in doing so, something ancient inside it began to exhale. Harry, ever the quiet observer, responded first. He began following Aliyah during her chores, occasionally grunting in approval, curling up in spots where her scent lingered. But his loyalty to Arthur remained intact, if not deepened. Where once he lingered cautiously, now he lay directly beside the old man's chair, even resting his heavy head against Arthur's slippered feet. Aliyah noticed and respected this new gravity between them. She started humming while sweeping, melodies from her childhood that filled the space with a gentle kind of life. She was not trying to fix Arthur. She was merely refusing to pretend he wasn't there. That small difference meant everything. William, meanwhile, remained in his own orbit, staring at screens, barking into phone calls, rarely noticing the quiet transformation taking place in the same rooms he wandered through without seeing. On the rare occasions he passed through the kitchen and saw Arthur sitting there with Harry asleep beside him, and Aliyah preparing tea in her blue and white uniform, he felt an odd discomfort, like walking into a scene that didn't belong to him. But he said nothing. He didn't yet realize he was no longer the center of this house's story. In the enormous mansion of William Carter, a millionaire recluse, lived his elderly and blind father, Arthur, a man scarred by autism and traumas that few ever understood. Since William's wife had passed, the house had become a temple of silence. The only constant companion was a pig named Harry, the exotic pet of William, as spoiled as he was lonely. Arthur spent his days mute and motionless until the arrival of Aliyah, a new maid with a vibrant soul and watchful eyes. Aliyah had only been working in the mansion for a few days, but something in its silence clung to her like damp fabric. It wasn't just the lack of noise. It was the emotional stillness, the vacuum created by a house filled with people who didn't speak to one another. William passed through like a shadow, dressed in a $1,000 suit, always too busy to see anything. Arthur, the old blind man, never moved from his chair unless prompted, and even then it was like watching stone come to life. The pig, Harry, seemed to be the only soul with curiosity. But Aliyah was a woman who had learned how to read sadness. She grew up in a small apartment with 5 siblings and a mother who carried the weight of the world on her spine. Emotions in her house were loud and raw, joy, grief, fear, never bottled, never ignored. That's why this mansion felt unnatural. It wasn't just quiet, it was suppressed. And so, on that strange Tuesday morning, as she scrubbed the kitchen counter for the 3rd time just to keep herself busy, she decided to disrupt the silence. She pulled out a small, beaten-up Bluetooth speaker from her bag, the same one she used during cleaning jobs in the city, and connected her phone. She scrolled through her playlists and chose something old school, something warm. The opening chords of an Al Green classic spilled into the kitchen. It was quiet at first, gentle, but soulful, unmistakable. The kind of music that always made her feel like someone understood. She hummed along under her breath, fully expecting the silence of the house to swallow it like everything else. But then she heard a sound, something soft, movement. When she turned, Arthur was shifting. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, he reached out with his cane, prodding the floor cautiously. Aaliyah froze, afraid to disturb whatever was happening. He rose with effort, joints creaking under the weight of years. He didn't ask what the sound was, didn't speak at all, but his feet carried him toward the center of the kitchen with a hesitancy that bordered on ritual. And then, with both hands gripping the edge of the table for balance, Arthur climbed, not like a young man would, but with the stubborn grace of someone who had been invisible for far too long. Aaliyah didn't move. She didn't dare speak. She simply watched, stunned, as the old man stood atop the kitchen table, his body trembling, his face turned toward the ceiling, and then, against every expectation, he danced. It wasn't a practice dance, it wasn't elegant or even steady, but it had rhythm, and more importantly, it had purpose. Arthur's feet shuffled awkwardly on the polished wood, and his arms moved like they remembered something his mind could no longer fully grasp. His cane clattered to the floor, forgotten, as his shoulders swayed gently in time with the music. Aaliyah's eyes welled up before she could stop herself. She wasn't sure if it was from joy or heartbreak, maybe both. And then, just when she thought the moment couldn't grow stranger, she heard a familiar grunt. Harry, the massive pig, had entered the room, sniffing the air with curiosity. He looked up at Arthur, and for several long seconds simply watched. Then, in an act that seemed to defy both logic and anatomy, Harry backed up a few steps, lowered his haunches, and leapt. The table wobbled under his weight, but held firm, and now there they were. An old blind man and a pig, side by side, both moving in ways that could only be described as dance. It wasn't polished. It wasn't beautiful. But it was real. Aaliyah had seen many things in her life. She had cleaned the homes of addicts, of grieving widows, of lonely men who tried to flirt their way out of depression. She'd watched children raise their siblings and elders wither under neglect, but nothing had prepared her for the sight before her now. There was no explanation. There was no logic. Arthur's feet tapped with surprising certainty, and Harry seemed to mimic the rhythm with his snorts and hops. Aaliyah reached for her phone, instinctively thinking to record it, but then stopped herself. Some things were too sacred to capture. Instead, she leaned against the counter and let herself feel the absurdity and beauty of the moment. For once, the mansion wasn't dead. It wasn't even quiet. It was alive, and in that unlikely pairing, man and pig, something had cracked open. She had no idea what it meant or what would come next. But in that instant, she believed she had witnessed something that not only broke the mansion's silence but rewrote it. She didn't need words. She didn't need permission. All she needed was that song, and the old man who had decided against all odds to remember he had a body capable of joy. Meanwhile, in the hallway just beyond the kitchen, one of the staff paused, hearing the music and the faint thumps on wood. He peeked in and froze. His mouth dropped open slightly, but he said nothing. Slowly, more curious staff gathered near the doorway, drawn by some invisible thread. No one spoke. No one interrupted. They simply watched, stunned into reverence, as Arthur turned in place, arms raised as if conducting some long-lost orchestra, and Harry turned beside him in a piggish parody of a waltz. No one laughed. It was not funny. It was not a joke. It was a kind of magic that silenced every cynical instinct they had grown in that cold house. Even William, who had returned home early from a cancelled meeting, stood at the edge of the kitchen, clutching his briefcase like it was the only real thing left in the world. He didn't know what to say, and so he said nothing, but his eyes locked on his father, his silent, immobile father, now alive with motion and surrounded by soul music and hardwood. Harry snorted again, giving a little hop, and Arthur laughed. He actually laughed, not loudly, but audibly. The staff watched unmoving, as if afraid that even blinking would break the spell. Aaliyah didn't dare change the song. She let it play through, then loop again. She didn't know how long it would last. 5 minutes? Maybe 10. But she would not be the one to end it. She simply stood there, watching with her whole body, feeling something shift, not just in Arthur, but in herself. This was why she took this job. This was why she never stopped looking people in the eye, even when they avoided hers. The dance, strange as it was, had told her something nobody in this house had bothered to say. Arthur was still in there. And Harry, well, Harry had known it all along. The pig stood close beside Arthur now, their movements slowly easing into stillness. Arthur reached down, carefully feeling for the animal's back. When his hand landed, he smiled, a small, subtle smile, but unmistakable. Aaliyah exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She didn't cheer, she didn't cry, she just understood. And in that clarity, something unnameable passed between her and the old man and his unlikely companion. The music faded, the house held its breath, and for the first time, perhaps ever, the mansion bore witness, in silence, to something almost magical. Since the morning Arthur climbed onto the table and danced with the pig, nothing inside the mansion remained quite the same. Aaliyah noticed it first. Harry, once aloof and uninterested in anyone but himself, began shadowing the old man as if tethered to his side by an invisible leash. Wherever Arthur wandered, slowly, cautiously, cane tapping against floorboards, Harry followed, sometimes bumping gently against his legs to guide him. At first, Aaliyah thought it might be coincidence, but by the third day, it was obvious. The pig had made a choice. He wasn't following out of routine or for food. He was following Arthur. The connection was real, inexplicable, and oddly beautiful. Arthur didn't speak about it, not that he spoke much at all, but there was a new calmness in the way he moved, a softness in his brow. Sometimes he would reach a hand down to confirm Harry's presence and rest his palm between the pig's ears for a long, still moment. It was like watching two exiles who had found each other. Aaliyah observed these changes in silence, resisting the urge to narrate them or explain them away. She knew what it meant for someone like Arthur to be seen, and now, for the first time in what was likely decades, he was. William finally noticed the change on a Wednesday afternoon. He was walking past the grand staircase when he stopped, startled by what he saw at the far end of the hall. Arthur was walking, not guided, not escorted, just walking slowly with Harry, pressed gently at his side, matching his pace step for step. William stood still, watching like he was trying to decode a puzzle. "Is he following him?" he asked out loud to no one. Aaliyah was dusting nearby and answered without looking up. "He's been doing that for days now," she said. William blinked, almost offended that something so strange had happened under his roof without his knowledge. "Harry doesn't follow anyone," he muttered. "He used to ignore even my wife." Aaliyah nodded, still working. "Maybe he just hadn't found the right person," she replied, her tone neutral. William didn't answer. He kept watching, eyes narrowed, as Arthur slowly made his way to the sitting room, Harry trotting loyally beside him. It wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Harry had been with them for years. He never bonded, he never lingered. And now he was acting like a service animal to the most distant person in the house. It was the first time William felt he had misunderstood something fundamental. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. Arthur began doing small things again, sitting by the window, humming tuneless melodies under his breath, even eating full meals. And always Harry was there. The pig would nudge Arthur gently toward chairs or sit beside him in stillness that somehow felt deeply protective. Once, when Arthur stumbled near the back patio, Harry brayed sharply, summoning Aaliyah in time to help. William watched it all unfold with a cautious detachment, like a scientist observing an experiment whose variables were no longer under control. He found himself watching old security footage, rewinding to that first moment when Harry jumped on the table and moved with Arthur like they'd known each other for lifetimes. It haunted him, not because it was absurd, but because it was honest. For the first time, William had to admit there might be things about his father he had never really tried to understand. He had always written Arthur off as distant, unreachable, broken. But now, watching this connection unfold, he began to wonder if maybe it hadn't been his father who shut everyone out, but rather everyone else who had refused to look deeper. Aaliyah became the quiet witness to this bond, tending to the house but never interfering with the ritual that Arthur and Harry had created. Sometimes she'd catch William lingering nearby, pretending to check his phone or skim a report while secretly watching the pair. She noticed he was quieter now, more observant, less quick to bark orders, slower to judge. She didn't say anything, but she saw the change and held onto it like a fragile thread. One afternoon, she found Arthur in the sunroom. Harry curled at his feet, and she took a chance. "Do you like having him around?" she asked softly. Arthur didn't respond right away, but his fingers moved gently through Harry's coarse hair. "He listens," he said finally, voice dry with disuse but clear. Aaliyah felt her throat tighten. It wasn't the words. It was the weight behind them. "Yes," she replied, her voice nearly a whisper. "He really does." Neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. For a man who had lived in silence for years, speaking only when it mattered, that sentence was more revealing than any speech. William, meanwhile, began carrying questions he had never allowed himself to ask. What if his father's silence had never been rejection? What if it had been exhaustion, defense, or worse, loneliness that no one had dared to approach? Watching Harry bond with Arthur stirred something sharp and unfamiliar in William's chest. Regret. Not the fleeting kind, but the deep, grinding kind that sets in when you realize you've built your life on assumptions. He remembered being a child and thinking his father was distant, only to realize now that he had simply been overwhelmed, buried beneath layers of confusion and isolation. William had spent years creating emotional distance, building a mansion where no one had to talk about pain. But now, watching a pig walk loyally beside a blind, autistic man, he wondered if he'd misunderstood everything. Maybe Arthur hadn't been hard to reach. Maybe no one had tried the right way. The realization sat heavy in him, but it also cracked something open, a door long shut. He didn't know how to approach his father yet, but for the first time in years, he wanted to. From that moment on, the house existed differently. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was thoughtful. Every person, from the staff to William himself, began adjusting their pace, their tone, as if taking cues from the rhythm set by Arthur and Harry. They didn't demand words or explanations. They simply accepted that something good was unfolding. The pig, once dismissed as a novelty, now walked with purpose. The old man, once forgotten in a quiet corner of a too-large house, now moved with meaning. Aaliyah watched it all with quiet pride. She knew better than anyone that connection didn't always come through words. Sometimes it came through presence, patience, and the simple willingness to witness. And William, standing in the hallway again, watching his father pass with Harry at his heels, asked himself something he'd never dared to consider before. Maybe his father had never been too closed off. Maybe he had simply never been truly seen. The music had returned to the mansion, not as a visitor but as a permanent resident. Every morning, like clockwork, Aaliyah would arrive and set the little Bluetooth speaker on the counter. At first, she picked familiar soul tracks, Al Green, Otis Redding, but soon began exploring jazz, Motown, even funk. No matter the song, Arthur would stir as if summoned by something deeper than sound. He never hesitated. As soon as the rhythm settled into the floorboards, he would rise, feeling his way to the center of the room. His body moved like it was rediscovering its own language, hesitant but proud. Harry, never far, would lumber beside him, clumsily turning and stepping in time with whatever his stout legs could manage. The pair had made the kitchen their stage, their sanctuary. What had once been the quietest part of the house was now alive, not with noise, but with something real. Aaliyah couldn't help but smile every time she saw it, but one day her hand reached instinctively for her phone. She began recording, not for the internet, not even for William, but to preserve what felt like the only honest thing in that house. The first video was short, just 30 seconds of Arthur swaying, while Harry shifted his weight in an awkward imitation of rhythm. Aaliyah hadn't intended to show anyone, but she made the mistake of watching it back during her break. The sound of Arthur's feet brushing the wood, Harry's snorts, and the faint crackle of music, it all struck her unexpectedly. Her eyes stung. That was when she realized this wasn't just sweet. It was important. Each day she filmed more. Little moments, Arthur reaching out and Harry nudging his hand, the two of them turning in circles as if the world outside the music didn't exist. There was no pretense, no effort to perform for anyone. It was purity. The videos became her quiet ritual. She never posted them, but she watched them every night before bed. Over time, they formed a timeline, a collection of moments that told a story she didn't yet know how to explain. Arthur never asked about the recordings. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he did, and just didn't care. But to Aaliyah, they were proof that healing didn't have to be loud. William noticed the shift, though he tried not to. He avoided the kitchen during the mornings now, pretending to make phone calls or hold meetings in his office. But he heard the music, always, and that music pulled at something inside him he didn't understand, the part that resented being outside the frame, the part that had never been invited into whatever Arthur and Harry had created. One morning, unable to stop himself, William stood just outside the kitchen door and peeked through the crack. There they were again, his father, nearly 80, blind and stiff-limbed, turning slowly in place to a Marvin Gaye track, and the pig plodding in odd circles, his ears flopping with each step. William's chest tightened. He didn't understand why the sight irritated him so deeply. It wasn't jealousy, at least not of Harry. It was something harder to name. Maybe it was the realization that his father, whom he'd always seen as broken, unreachable, was now free in a way William had never been. Not even once. And what stung worse, Arthur had found that freedom not through therapy or medicine or some elaborate plan, but through a pig and a song. The envy didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as confusion, then skepticism, then irritation. William tried rationalizing it. He's just reacting to the music, he told himself. It's nothing. But he couldn't escape the ache that followed. For years, he'd believed his father incapable of joy, of expression, of connection. And now that belief was unraveling in front of him, undeniably, irreversibly. What did that say about him? That he'd never even tried, that it took a pig to notice what William had refused to see? The more he watched, the worse it became. Harry wasn't just some pet anymore. He was a mirror, one that showed William exactly how absent he'd been. Not physically, no. William had paid the bills, kept the house running, hired staff. But he had never looked at his father like Harry did, with patience, with curiosity, with trust. And it burned to realize that somewhere along the way he'd started seeing Arthur less as a man and more as a burden to manage. Harry had no such baggage. The pig simply saw him. Aaliyah began to sense something shifting in William. He wasn't speaking more, but his silences had changed. They were no longer indifferent, they were watchful. One afternoon, she walked into the hallway and caught him holding her phone, watching one of the saved videos. He didn't hear her approach. Arthur was dancing to a Curtis Mayfield song, and Harry was nudging his hip with a rhythm that was almost comedic. But William wasn't laughing. His face was still, his jaw clenched. Aaliyah didn't interrupt. She stood quietly, giving him space. When he finally noticed her, he didn't offer an excuse. He just said, "He never did this when I was young." Aaliyah hesitated. "Maybe he never had a reason to," she answered carefully. William nodded, but the words hit harder than expected. He handed the phone back and walked away. That night, she found the speaker still playing in the empty kitchen, and Arthur asleep in his chair, Harry curled beneath it. The music was still on, looping quietly. Aaliyah didn't turn it off. And so the ritual continued. Arthur danced every day. Harry danced too, awkward, loud, sincere. Aaliyah recorded, and William watched from the edges, from the doorway, from behind half-closed doors. The house, once so sterile, now carried traces of something vulnerable, not loud, not dramatic, just real. And as William stood alone one morning, hidden just beyond view, watching his father move freely to the music, he felt the weight of a question he had never asked. Not to his father, not to himself. What if he had missed everything? Not because Arthur had shut him out, but because William had never tried to step in. He watched his father spin slowly, arms wide, the pig at his side, and for the first time in his adult life, William felt envy, not of the pig, but of the freedom his father had found, a freedom he himself had never known how to reach. William had been watching in silence for too long. Each morning that Arthur danced beside the pig, each time Aaliyah smiled and filmed, something inside him tightened. It wasn't just discomfort, it was a loss of control, a fraying of the carefully constructed image of his home, his legacy, his family. For years he had held the narrative. His father was a damaged man, unreachable, withdrawn. The mansion was quiet because silence was safer than disappointment. But now, Aaliyah, this woman who had only recently entered their world, had flipped the story on its head with nothing but kindness, music, and a cell phone camera. William couldn't take it anymore. That morning, as Arthur swayed slowly to Sam Cooke and Harry tapped his hoof on the tiled floor, William stepped into the kitchen, no longer content to lurk. Aaliyah paused the music. Arthur stopped mid-turn. Harry blinked. "We need to talk," William said, voice colder than he intended. Aaliyah raised an eyebrow, then followed him into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, muffling the kitchen's energy. For a beat, they simply stood there, and then William began, emotion bubbling beneath every word. "You don't understand what you're doing," he snapped. "You're giving him something that won't last, false hope. He's fragile. He doesn't know what's real anymore." Aaliyah didn't flinch. Her expression was steady, calm, but there was fire behind her eyes. "He knows exactly what's real," she said. "More than you do, apparently." William scowled. "You think this is healthy? Filming him, encouraging this circus act with the pig?" He pointed a finger at her, his voice tightening. "You're turning his pain into a performance." Aaliyah stepped closer, her tone sharpening. "No, I'm witnessing it. There's a difference. You see a spectacle because you've never taken 5 seconds to actually look at your father as a human being." William opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't stop. "He's dancing because he wants to. He's laughing because he can. And Harry, the pig you used to treat like furniture, sees him clearer than you ever have." The air between them buzzed with tension, but neither backed down. William's hands clenched at his sides, jaw set. But for the first time, someone was saying the thing he'd buried for decades, and he had no answer. Aaliyah's voice softened slightly, but her resolve never wavered. "You think this is about control? About someone stealing your family's dignity?" she asked. "But William, you never had control. You had fear and silence and guilt." He turned away, pacing a few steps before facing her again. "You think I haven't tried? You think I didn't spend years hiring doctors, therapists, specialists?" His voice cracked slightly. "He never responded. Not like this." Aaliyah nodded slowly. "Because none of them saw him. They treated symptoms. They didn't stay. Harry stays. I stay. That's why it's different." William looked at her, genuinely shaken. There was a hollow ache behind his eyes, one she hadn't seen before. "You think I don't want to understand him," he said quietly. "I just don't know how." That was the closest thing to vulnerability he'd ever shown. But Aaliyah didn't let up. "Then learn. Start now. But don't stand in the way of something that's finally real, just because you weren't the one to start it." William stood frozen, as if trying to absorb the weight of her words, the weight of everything he hadn't said, hadn't done, hadn't dared to feel. Aaliyah took a breath, then added, "You're not the villain, William, but you are the one who locked the doors." She didn't wait for a reply. She stepped past him, back into the kitchen, where the music was still paused and Arthur stood waiting, his hand brushing Harry's back. William remained in the hallway, stunned, his chest burning with something that felt dangerously close to shame. He'd spent years controlling narratives, managing outcomes, but in this moment he realized he had never once confronted his own role in the emotional absence that ruled the house. Now, with a single confrontation, Aaliyah had torn open the truth he'd buried under money and silence. And she had done it with honesty, not cruelty. Still, it cut. Back in the kitchen, Aaliyah pressed play. The music resumed, smooth and gentle. Arthur turned again, slowly finding the rhythm. Harry followed with a trot. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. William lingered by the doorway, invisible again, but this time not by choice. He had no words to offer, no rebuttal to deliver. He just watched. He watched the man he had called broken sway with quiet grace, watched the pig he had once dismissed nuzzle closer, and watched Aaliyah, unshaken, present, strong. He felt something shift in him, though he couldn't name it yet. But he knew, with aching clarity, that the silence in that moment was unlike any other. It was not cold or lifeless. It was not the sound of isolation. It was the sound of something raw, something broken opening. And in that rawness, William heard a truth louder than music. What his father felt was not illusion. It was life. And the pig understood it better than he did. It was nearly midnight when William found the letter. He had been aimlessly sifting through an old desk drawer in his childhood bedroom, a space he rarely entered since the funeral. The envelope was unsealed, yellowed with age, and addressed in his own handwriting, shaky, uneven, to Mom. He stared at it for several minutes before unfolding the single page inside. The letter had been written decades ago, in a moment of overwhelming frustration and sadness, but it still struck him with a rawness that made his chest tighten. "I try, but I don't feel anything when I look at him," it read. "Sometimes I think there's something broken in me. I want to love him, but I don't know how." The confession was cruel and honest and trembling with shame. He remembered writing it at 16, shortly after his mother had suffered a stroke, feeling lost and angry and utterly alone. He had meant to give it to her, to beg for her guidance, but the fear of what it revealed had stopped him. Now, decades later, she was gone, and the letter was still here, silent evidence of everything he had never been brave enough to say. For hours, William sat alone in the hallway, letter in hand, unable to move. The house was quiet, but not in the cold, stifling way it used to be. From the kitchen, he could hear the soft hum of music still playing. Aaliyah had likely forgotten to turn it off again. He considered tearing the letter in half, or burning it, or stuffing it back into the drawer and pretending it didn't exist. But something inside him, something that had cracked open ever since Arthur had started dancing, pushed against that instinct. The shame hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Now it felt like something that needed to be named, not hidden. He folded the letter again, walked slowly toward the kitchen, and found Aaliyah wiping down the counter. She looked up, surprised to see him at that hour, especially with an expression so open on his face. Without a word, he extended the paper to her. "What is it?" she asked softly. William hesitated. "Something I should have said a long time ago," he replied. She took it carefully, reading silently as the music continued behind them. When she finally looked up, her eyes were glassy. Aaliyah didn't speak right away, and William appreciated that. She wasn't trying to console him with cliches or empty comforts. Instead, she folded the letter back along its old creases and placed it on the table between them. "You were a kid," she said finally. "You were scared. You were grieving her while she was still alive." William nodded slowly, guilt still thick in his throat. "But I meant it," he said. "I didn't know how to love him. I still don't. And now he's dancing, smiling with a pig, and I feel like I missed everything." Aaliyah shook her head gently. "You didn't miss everything. You're here now. You gave me that letter. That means you're ready to see him, not the version you carried around in your head, but the real man." William sighed. "But what if it's too late?" She reached out and placed a hand on his. "Then let today be the first day that isn't." There was no grand epiphany in that moment, no dramatic transformation, but there was an opening, a small shift, and for the first time, William didn't resist it. They sat in silence for a while longer. Aaliyah eventually stood, made them both tea, and returned to the table. William traced the edge of the envelope as if it were a wound still healing. "He used to sit at this table," he murmured, "for hours, just still. I thought he was broken." Aaliyah sipped her tea and replied, "Maybe he was just waiting for someone to sit with him." That sentence landed with more weight than either of them anticipated. William's shoulders sagged, as if a burden he had carried for years was beginning, slowly, to slide off. "I used to think that if I didn't force him to change, he'd disappear," he confessed. "So I pushed, or worse, I ignored him. I didn't want to feel like his caretaker. I wanted a father who could protect me, not someone I had to protect." Aaliyah nodded. But what if protection wasn't what he needed? What if he just needed permission to be seen? William didn't answer, but her words followed him deep into the night, echoing softly in the spaces where resentment had once lived. As the night wore on, William rose to check on Arthur. He found his father asleep in the living room, Harry curled against his leg like a loyal dog. The old man's chest rose and fell steadily, his hands loose at his sides. He looked peaceful, not the ghostly figure William remembered from his youth, but someone entirely present. William watched them for a long time, taking in the stillness, not the silence of suppression, but the kind that comes after something has been spoken aloud. Then he returned to the kitchen, where Aaliyah was finishing her tea. "You know," he said, voice low but steady, "my father doesn't need to be fixed. He never did." Aaliyah looked up. "No, he didn't." William exhaled. "He just needed someone who'd dance with him." His voice cracked as he said it, but he didn't look away. Aaliyah smiled, not the kind meant to cheer someone up, but one that simply said, "I see you." The letter still sat on the table between them, unopened now but understood. For the first time in a lifetime of silence, something true had been spoken. And so, in that quiet night, as the house held its breath around them, William admitted to Aaliyah with honest, unflinching eyes, "My father doesn't need healing. He needed someone who'd dance with him." But William, moved by a strange momentum he didn't fully understand, decided one morning over coffee to organize a small garden party. Not a gala, not a charity event, just a simple, unpretentious get-together. "No suits, no speeches," he told Aaliyah as she blinked in disbelief. "Just food, music, people." At first, the idea seemed absurd to her. The house had lived in shadows for so long, it felt sacrilegious to fill it with light. But the more he talked, the more she saw he wasn't trying to throw a party for others. He was trying to shift the gravitational pull of his own world. So she helped. They scrubbed the neglected garden furniture, ordered decorations that would have made William scoff weeks ago, and called neighbors who thought he'd either died or moved to Europe. William even dialed the numbers of a few childhood friends, former business partners, and old employees, many of whom answered with voices full of disbelief. By Saturday afternoon, The mansion's backyard had become something else entirely, something living, breathing, and for the first time in a long while, welcoming. Guests began arriving just after 3 p.m. There was laughter as they were greeted by an unusually warm William and a radiant Aaliyah, who handled introductions with grace. Even the staff, who had once gone about their duties with robotic obedience, now moved with something that looked like genuine anticipation. Conversations sprouted like wildflowers. A gardener reminisced with an old butler. A former chauffeur laughed with a retired chef. Neighbors marveled at the man who had once been the mansion's invisible ghost. But amid all this change, it was Arthur's entrance that shifted the energy entirely. Dressed neatly, his dark glasses gleaming in the sun, he walked slowly toward the garden, guided gently by Aaliyah and followed loyally by Harry. The pig trotted at his side with a small green vest snugly wrapped around his wide belly. Embroidered on it, in neat white stitching, were the words, "Dance Partner." Laughter erupted, not mocking, but warm, surprised, delighted. Someone clapped. Arthur, unaware of the attention in the usual sense, stopped near the garden center as if waiting for a cue. And then, as though on instinct, he raised his arms and began to sway. William stood frozen, his wine untouched in his glass. The image before him was both surreal and completely logical. Arthur, the man he had once written off as unreachable, was dancing again, but this time not in isolation. This time he had an audience, and more importantly, he had a partner. Harry jumped up on a low platform meant for flower arrangements and began mimicking Arthur's swaying with an awkward rhythm that sent the crowd into delighted gasps. Arthur, sensing the pig's movement beside him, smiled faintly and tilted his head as if acknowledging the creature. The dance wasn't choreographed. It wasn't elegant, but it was magnetic. People stopped their conversations, their drinks, their wandering, to watch. Some laughed, some clapped, and others unexpectedly cried. The image was absurd and beautiful, a blind old man dancing in the sun beside a pig in a vest, completely at peace with himself in a way few ever truly are. A child in the crowd whispered to his mother, "Is he magic?" And the mother, tearing up, nodded. Maybe. William didn't speak. He just kept watching, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. Aaliyah moved beside him but didn't say anything at first. Then gently she asked, "You okay?" William took a moment before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to see this. And now that it's happening, I don't know what to do with it." She smiled. "You don't have to do anything. Just let it happen." He nodded, swallowing a thick emotion rising in his throat. "He's free," he said suddenly. "Look at him. No shame, no filter, just himself." Aaliyah watched the scene, her heart full. "That's what love does," she replied. "It gives you permission to exist." William looked at her. He never needed permission. I just never knew how to offer it. Their eyes met, and something silent passed between them. An understanding built not on guilt or pity, but on shared witnessing. Then before William could retreat into old habits, Aaliyah nudged him forward. "Go, be with him." William hesitated, then took a few steps toward the dancing duo, but paused just far enough to stay unseen. He wasn't ready to join them. Not yet. But he was no longer running from it either. As the music played on, the unlikely dance continued. Someone brought out a birthday cake, even though it wasn't anyone's birthday. Others pulled out their phones, but not to film, just to light up the moment, to celebrate it with their presence. There were no long speeches, no formal declarations, just dancing, clapping, quiet tears, and a sense that something long buried had been exhumed and gently revived. Children ran across the grass. An old friend of William's toasted quietly to second chances, and through it all, Arthur moved, slowly but confidently, with Harry never more than a step away. For William, it felt like watching someone be reborn without needing to die first. The house behind them, once a shrine to silence, now echoed softly with music and the murmur of connection. And while William still carried regrets too heavy to name, he realized they no longer controlled him. They didn't have to. Because at the heart of everything, the dancing, the laughter, the improbable joy, was a simple truth. Belonging doesn't need to be earned. Sometimes it just needs to be allowed. And so, in the middle of that strange and beautiful gathering, under the open sky and surrounded by people who never thought they'd return to this place, Arthur danced once more, now joined by Harry in his little vest. And the mansion, once a monument to silence, pulsed with something new, belonging. In the days that followed the garden party, something profoundly simple began to unfold. Arthur and Harry, now unofficial legends among the guests who had witnessed their dance, became an inseparable pair. Wherever Arthur went, guided by memory, instinct, or perhaps the gentle nudges of his cane, Harry was not far behind. He walked beside the old man with an almost protective attentiveness, as if he understood that his role had shifted from spectacle to companion. William observed this silently from the sidelines at first. He would watch from the hallway as Arthur shuffled through the mansion's vast spaces, the pig padding alongside him with determined steps. William didn't know whether to be impressed or disturbed by how much space the animal had taken up in their lives. But every time he considered objecting, he would see Arthur's faint smile, or the way his hand naturally lowered to brush against Harry's back, as if to confirm the pig's presence. It was never a grand gesture, but there was something ritualistic about it, like touching a compass or a lifeline. It was in these small moments that William began to feel a weight he had long carried begin to shift. At first, William didn't know how to join them. It felt like an invitation he hadn't received. Sitting in silence beside Arthur had always been easy before, because it required nothing. But now the silence had transformed. It wasn't the absence of conversation anymore. It was full of meaning, brimming with history, presence, and something dangerously close to love. One afternoon, William entered the kitchen to find Arthur seated at the table, gently humming a melody he must have heard during one of the dance sessions. Harry sat beside his chair, occasionally lifting his snout as if nodding along. William hesitated before sitting down across from his father. No one spoke for several minutes. Then, without thinking, William asked, "Do you remember Mom singing that song?" Arthur didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause he nodded. "She had a soft voice," Arthur said, his own voice raspy from disuse. It was one of the few times William had ever heard him speak voluntarily. That sentence cracked something open between them, subtle but irreversible. From that point on, William made it a habit to sit next to Arthur once a day, sometimes bringing tea, sometimes nothing at all. There were no expectations. That, he realized, was the point. Aaliyah continued to watch from the periphery, never intruding but always present. She had become more than a maid at this point, more like the house's quiet heartbeat. She noticed the way Arthur leaned slightly in William's direction now when he spoke, how Harry would occasionally bump his snout into William's legs as if urging him forward, reminding him that progress, no matter how awkward, was still progress. One morning, as William sat watching his father and the pig share a nap under the sunlit window bench, Aaliyah approached him with a quiet observation. "He's always had that in him," she said. "You're just seeing it now." William looked at her, uncertain. "You mean the joy?" She shook her head. "No. The capacity for connection. You thought he was unreachable, but maybe he was just unseen." William turned his eyes back to his father, whose hand rested gently on Harry's back as they both slept peacefully. "I didn't know how to look," he admitted. "I thought I had to fix something that was never broken." Aaliyah gave him a knowing smile. "We don't need to fix people. We just need to meet them where they are." Staff stopped tiptoeing. Conversations started lasting longer. William found himself remembering things he had buried, like the way his father used to tap his foot under the dinner table when jazz music played, or how he once built William a model train set with more care than William had ever realized. Those memories didn't hurt anymore. They felt like bridges, felt like... One afternoon, Harry leaped onto the kitchen bench unprompted, causing Arthur to laugh, actually laugh, a wheezy, open-mouth sound that William hadn't heard since childhood. William caught the moment with his phone, not for social media or nostalgia, but for himself, to prove that it had happened, to ensure he wouldn't later convince himself it had just been a dream. That same evening, he sat beside Arthur and played back the video. "That's you," William said. Arthur tilted his head. "Is that what I sound like when I'm alive?" William chuckled softly, then turned serious. "That's what you sound like when you're loved." Arthur didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth lifted slightly, and his hand reached almost blindly to rest once more on Harry. And then came the final moment, the one no one would forget. It happened almost casually, as if orchestrated by instinct. The old speaker in the kitchen, now a familiar guest, crackled to life. Arthur stood, slowly, with the stiffness of age, but the steadiness of purpose. With a slight grunt and Alia's steadying hand, he climbed up onto the sturdy kitchen table, this time needing no help from William. Harry, without hesitation, jumped up beside him. Together, they swayed, not in time with the music, not in perfect rhythm, but in unison. William didn't stop them. He didn't film. He didn't object. He simply stood and watched, arms at his sides, letting the moment imprint itself into his memory. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't about healing. It wasn't even about reconciliation. It was about presence. About a blind man and a pig dancing on a table, sharing something that none of the mansion's wealth or legacy could ever replicate. No one interrupted. No one asked why. And in the end, it wasn't the gold-framed portraits or the imported marble that people remembered. It was that image, an old blind man dancing with a pig on top of a kitchen table, more alive than he had ever been. Thanks for watching this unforgettable story from Mr. Edward's Tales. If this tale touched your heart like it did ours, give it a like, subscribe for more emotional journeys, and share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Know someone who'd love this story? Send it their way. Stories like this are meant to be felt and shared. See you in the next one.